The bustling corridors of O'Hare International Airport seemed to embrace Ibrahim Traore with an unexpected sense of peace as he stepped through the arrivals gate. For the first time in months, perhaps years, he was just another face in the crowd. No presidential motorcade waited outside, no security detail flanked his movements, no press cameras followed his every step. Today he was simply a man, a cousin, an uncle, a friend, carrying a small overnight bag and wearing clothes that deliberately avoided any hint of his true identity. The weight of this anonymity felt like shedding a heavy coat after a long winter. Ibrahim had chosen his attire carefully: a navy blazer, dark slacks that could have come from any department store, and polished but unremarkable shoes. No designer labels, no presidential seal, no indication that the man walking through Terminal 3 governed a nation of over 22 million people. Around him, the familiar symphony of airport life played out. Hurried travelers dragged rolling suitcases, their phones pressed to their ears as they coordinated pickups or confirmed meeting times. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves. Vendors called out their wares, and the constant hum of overhead announcements created a white noise that Ibrahim found oddly comforting. In this chaos, he was invisible, exactly as he had hoped. His steps were measured, unhurried. For once there was no schedule to keep beyond his own desires. No diplomatic protocol to follow, no advisors whispering urgent matters in his ear. The freedom was intoxicating, even as it felt foreign after so many years of structured, supervised existence. As he made his way toward the exit, Ibrahim's mind wandered to the surprise that awaited. Aisha, his beloved cousin, had given birth to triplets just 6 weeks ago, a miracle that had brought joy to their entire extended family. When Ibrahim had learned the news during a particularly difficult week of budget negotiations and international trade disputes, he had made an impulsive decision. He would visit her, not as President Traore with an official delegation, but as cousin Ibrahim, with gifts and genuine affection. The plan had been months in the making, coordinated in secret even from his closest advisors. He had told only his security chief that he needed 2 days of personal time, a phrase that had caused considerable consternation among his staff. Presidents of African nations, particularly those dealing with ongoing security challenges, did not typically take unscheduled personal trips to America. But Ibrahim had been insistent. He had told his chief of staff, "I need to remember who I am beneath the title. 2 days, 48 hours to be a human being instead of a political figure." The taxi ride from O'Hare into the suburbs had been a revelation in itself. The driver, a cheerful Hispanic man in his 50s named Carlos, had chatted about the weather, the Cubs' chances this season, and his daughter's upcoming quinceañera. To Carlos, Ibrahim was just another passenger, polite, well-dressed, with a slight accent that suggested international origins, but nothing more remarkable than that. "First time in Chicago?" Carlos had asked, glancing in the rearview mirror. "Visiting family," Ibrahim had replied, and the simple truth of it had made him smile. No mention of state visits or diplomatic missions, just family. The cityscape gradually transformed as they drove west. The towering downtown buildings gave way to tree-lined streets, then to the manicured perfection of Winnetka, one of Chicago's most affluent suburbs. Here, the houses sat on sprawling lots, their lawns maintained with almost military precision. Every driveway was freshly sealed, every garden bed bordered with decorative stones, every mailbox positioned at exactly the same distance from the curb. It was beautiful in its uniformity, but there was something sterile about the perfection. As the taxi wound through the quiet streets, Ibrahim noticed the absence of life that he was accustomed to in his own neighborhoods back home. No children playing in front yards, no neighbors chatting over fences, no elderly men sitting on porches watching the world go by. The silence was profound and somehow unsettling. "Nice neighborhood," Carlos commented as they turned onto Elm Street. "Real quiet, real safe. That's what people pay for out here." Ibrahim nodded, though something in the driver's tone suggested layers of meaning that he didn't fully grasp at the moment. The taxi slowed to a stop near what Ibrahim hoped was the general vicinity of Aisha's address. "This work for you?" Carlos asked. "I can keep looking if you want. These houses all look the same to me." "This is perfect, thank you," Ibrahim replied, handing over the fare plus a generous tip. As Carlos drove away with a friendly wave, Ibrahim stood alone on the sidewalk, suddenly aware of how quiet this world was. The only sounds were the distant hum of air conditioning units and the soft whisper of an automatic sprinkler system watering an already perfect lawn. It was then that Ibrahim made his first mistake, though he wouldn't recognize it as such until much later. He reached into his jacket pocket for the piece of paper where he had written Aisha's exact address, only to realize with a sinking heart that he had left it on the hotel room desk. In his excitement to surprise her, he had rushed out without double-checking that he had everything he needed. His phone, which might have solved the problem immediately, had died during the flight. The international adapter he had brought was still packed in his luggage back at the hotel. For a moment, Ibrahim experienced something he hadn't felt in years: genuine helplessness. As president, every logistical detail of his life was managed by others. There was always someone with a backup plan, always a contingency for every possible situation. But here, in this pristine American suburb, he was truly on his own. Ibrahim began walking, hoping that something would look familiar from the photos Aisha had shared. She had described her neighborhood in their phone calls: the white colonial houses, the mature oak trees, the small park at the end of her street, where she hoped to take the babies once they were older. But now, surrounded by dozens of nearly identical homes, those descriptions seemed frustratingly vague. The uniformity that had seemed charming from the taxi window now felt almost oppressive. Each house was a variation on the same theme: colonial revival architecture, meticulously maintained landscaping, and an air of expensive tranquility. The mailboxes bore surnames like Johnson, Williams, Peterson, and McKenna, solid, traditional American names that told a story of generational wealth and social stability. After 20 minutes of walking, Ibrahim had to admit he was truly lost. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns, and the temperature was dropping. He needed help, but the prospect of approaching strangers felt daunting in a way it never had before. As president, people approached him. He rarely found himself in the position of petitioner. It was then that he noticed the house with the rose garden. Unlike the other properties with their carefully controlled landscaping, this front yard burst with color and apparent spontaneity with an abundance that spoke of genuine love rather than professional maintenance. Wind chimes hung from the porch, creating gentle music in the evening breeze. There was something welcoming about the scene that gave Ibrahim hope. He approached the front door, noting the way the porch light cast a warm glow over everything. The doorbell was one of those old-fashioned types with a brass button that actually rang a bell somewhere inside the house. Ibrahim pressed it gently and waited, rehearsing in his mind how he would explain his situation. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 70s, her silver hair pulled back in a careful bun. She wore a cardigan despite the mild evening temperature, and her pale blue eyes immediately began assessing him with the kind of practiced suspicion that comes from a lifetime of caution. Her gaze traveled from his face to his shoes and back again, taking in details that she would later describe to her neighbors with remarkable precision. "Yes," she said, the single word carrying more frost than the evening air. Ibrahim smiled politely, drawing on years of diplomatic training. "Good evening, ma'am. I apologize for disturbing you. I'm visiting family in this neighborhood. My cousin just had triplets, and I'm afraid I've gotten a bit turned around. My phone died, and I was wondering if I might use yours to call her. I'd be happy to pay for the call." The woman's expression hardened further. She took a step back, though she kept her hand on the doorframe. "This is a secure community. We don't typically have, unexpected visitors." The pause before "unexpected visitors" hung in the air like a question mark. Ibrahim felt a small knot form in his stomach, though he couldn't quite identify why. "I understand your caution, ma'am. I'm just trying to find my family. Perhaps you know the Johnsons? They live on Oak Street. My cousin married into the family." "I know everyone on Oak Street," she replied curtly, "and I can tell you there's no one there expecting visitors like you." "Like me?" Ibrahim asked quietly, though he was beginning to understand. The woman's chin lifted slightly. "You know what I mean. This kind of thing always starts the same way. A sob story about family, a request to use the phone, and then suddenly there's trouble. We've had break-ins, you know. The police warned us about this exact scenario." Ibrahim raised his hands slightly, palms open, in a gesture of peace. "Ma'am, I assure you I mean no harm. I'm simply trying to locate my cousin's home. If you're uncomfortable letting me use your phone, perhaps you could just point me toward Oak Street?" But the woman was already reaching for the phone that hung on the wall just inside her door. "I'm calling the police. You need to leave my property immediately." "Ma'am, please," Ibrahim said, taking a step back from the door to show he wasn't threatening. "There's no need for police. I'll simply find another way to—" "Don't tell me what there's need for," she snapped, her finger already dialing 911. "I know your type. You case neighborhoods, looking for weak spots, for easy targets. Well, not on my watch." Ibrahim felt something cold settle in his chest. He was experiencing something that millions of people faced regularly, but which had been largely foreign to his own lived experience. As president, he was surrounded by people who treated him with deference, even those who disagreed with his policies. Here, for the first time in decades, he was being judged solely on his appearance and found wanting.
In the distance, he could hear the growing wail of sirens. The police cruiser rounded the corner, with its lights flashing, but siren now silent, a professional courtesy to the upscale neighborhood, where loud noises were generally discouraged, even during arrests. Ibrahim stood calmly on the sidewalk, his hands visible at his sides, drawing on every piece of training he had received about de-escalation and peaceful resolution of conflicts. Two officers emerged from the vehicle. Officer Sarah Mitchell, a 10-year veteran with short blonde hair and the kind of confident stride that came from years of being in control, and Officer James Rodriguez, younger and newer to the force, with observant dark eyes that seemed to take in more details than his partner. "Sir, we received a report of a disturbance," Officer Mitchell announced, her hand resting casually but deliberately on her belt. "Can you tell us what you're doing in this neighborhood?" Ibrahim kept his voice level and respectful. "Officers, I'm visiting family. My cousin lives somewhere on Oak Street, and I'm afraid I've gotten lost. I asked this homeowner if I could use her phone to call my cousin, but she became alarmed. I understand her caution, and I've moved away from her property as requested." Officer Rodriguez stepped closer, studying Ibrahim's face. "Do you have identification?" "Yes, of course." Ibrahim began to reach slowly toward his jacket pocket. "Hold it right there," Officer Mitchell commanded sharply. "Keep your hands where we can see them. James, check his pockets." As Officer Rodriguez approached, Ibrahim said quietly, "Officers, if I may suggest, my identification is in my inside jacket pocket. I have a diplomatic passport and everyone's got a story. Save it for the station." Officer Rodriguez interrupted. Officer Rodriguez found the wallet and opened it. Ibrahim watched the young officer's face carefully, waiting for the moment of recognition that would clear up this misunderstanding. But Officer Rodriguez simply glanced at the documents without really examining them. His attention focused more on whether Ibrahim might be carrying weapons. "Clean," he reported to his partner. "Just a wallet, some cash, and what looks like foreign ID." "Foreign," Officer Mitchell repeated, as if that explained everything. "Turn around, sir. Hands behind your back." The handcuffs clicked into place with a sound that would haunt Ibrahim for weeks afterward. The metal was cold against his wrists, but the psychological weight was far heavier. As they guided him toward the police car, Ibrahim caught sight of the woman who had called police watching from her window, her face a mixture of satisfaction and continued wariness. "Officers," Ibrahim tried once more as they approached the vehicle, "if you would simply examine my identification carefully, I believe this misunderstanding can be resolved quickly." "That's what they all say," Officer Mitchell replied, opening the rear door. "Watch your head." The back seat of the police cruiser was a world unto itself, separated from the front by reinforced plexiglass, with door handles that didn't work from the inside, and windows that couldn't be lowered. As they drove through the quiet streets toward the police station, Ibrahim found himself studying this neighborhood that had seemed so welcoming just an hour ago. From this new perspective, details he had missed before became obvious. The security cameras mounted discreetly under eaves, the "protected by" signs from various alarm companies, the way the sidewalks seemed to discourage pedestrian traffic. This was a community that had quite literally insulated itself from the outside world. In the front seat, the two officers were having a conversation they clearly thought Ibrahim couldn't hear. Another one trying the visiting family story. They scout these neighborhoods, looking for empty houses, checking security setups. "Did you see his clothes, though? Pretty well dressed for a typical prowler." That's exactly how they do it now. They dress the part, use sophisticated stories. The captain warned us about this new trend just last week. Ibrahim closed his eyes and leaned back against the hard plastic seat. He thought about Aisha, probably wondering where he was, maybe starting to worry when he didn't show up as planned. He thought about his own country, where he had ethnic groups, different economic classes, different religious communities. The irony was not lost on him that here, in the nation he had often looked to as a model of democracy and equality, he was experiencing firsthand the kind of prejudice he had only read about in reports. The police station was a modest brick building that looked like it had been built in the 1970s and updated sporadically ever since. Inside, the familiar institutional atmosphere of government buildings everywhere greeted them. Fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill, linoleum floors worn smooth by decades of foot traffic, and the peculiar smell of disinfectant mixed with old coffee. Ibrahim was processed with efficient indifference. His personal effects were catalogued: wallet, keys, a small notepad, and a pen with the presidential seal that no one bothered to examine closely. He was photographed, fingerprinted, and assigned a number. Through it all, he maintained the dignity that years of public service had ingrained in him, answering questions politely and following instructions without resistance.
The holding cell was small and windowless, with a metal bench bolted to the wall and little else. Ibrahim sat down and finally allowed himself to feel the full weight of what was happening. He was not just any wrongfully arrested person, he was a head of state, and yet in this moment that meant nothing. His power, his influence, his ability to command respect and attention had been stripped away by assumptions based solely on the color of his skin. But rather than feeling sorry for himself, Ibrahim found his thoughts turning to others. How many people experience this same dehumanization every day? How many had their dignity stripped away by officers who saw a threat instead of a person? How many family reunions, job interviews, or simple errands were interrupted by suspicion that had nothing to do with actions and everything to do with appearance? Hours passed. The holding cell had no clock, but Ibrahim could gauge the time by the changing sounds from the main station area. The evening shift arriving, phones ringing less frequently, the building settling into its nighttime rhythm. He had missed dinner with Aisha. By now she would be worried. Michael, her husband, would be making calls, trying to figure out what had happened to their expected guest. Officer Daniel Chen was 6 weeks into his career with the Winnetka Police Department, and he approached every shift with the enthusiasm of someone who had spent 4 years studying criminal justice and another year in the police academy. Unlike some of his colleagues who had become cynical after years on the force, Daniel still believed in the ideals that had drawn him to law enforcement: protecting the innocent, serving the community, and ensuring that justice was applied fairly to all. That evening, as he made his rounds through the station, Daniel noticed they had someone in holding. This wasn't unusual. Drunk drivers, domestic disturbance calls, and the occasional shoplifter were routine parts of suburban police work. But something about this particular detainee caught his attention. The man sat with perfect posture, his hands folded calmly in his lap despite the handcuffs. His clothing was expensive but understated, and his demeanor suggested someone accustomed to dignity and respect. Most people in holding were either agitated, belligerent, or resigned to their fate. This man seemed almost meditative. Daniel approached the duty sergeant, Officer Thompson, a 20-year veteran who was known for his no-nonsense approach to police work. "What's the story with the guy in holding?" Daniel asked. Thompson barely looked up from his paperwork. "A prowling in Winnetka. Mrs. Henderson called it in. Said he was going door to door with some story about looking for family. Classic casing behavior. Did you run his ID? Claims he doesn't have American ID. Says he's some kind of foreign dignitary." Thompson chuckled. "They always claim to be somebody important when they get caught." Something about this dismissive attitude bothered Daniel. He had learned in his training that proper identification procedures were crucial, not just for legal reasons, but for basic human dignity. "Mind if I take a look at what he's carrying?" Thompson waved toward the evidence locker. "Knock yourself out, rookie, but don't spend all night on it. Guy's probably getting deported in the morning anyway." Daniel retrieved the plastic bag containing Ibrahim's personal effects and returned to his desk. He opened the wallet carefully, treating it with the same respect he would want his own possessions treated if their situations were reversed. Inside, he found several items that immediately caught his attention. A diplomatic passport with a cover he didn't recognize, several cards with foreign text, and what appeared to be some kind of official identification. The main ID card was impressive: heavy stock paper with security features, an official photograph, and text in both French and Arabic. But it was the English translation at the bottom that made Daniel's heart skip. President of Burkina Faso. Daniel stared at the card for a long moment, then turned to his computer. A quick internet search for Ibrahim Traore, Burkina Faso, brought up hundreds of results. News articles, official government photos, United Nations Assembly speeches, meetings with world leaders. The face in every image was unmistakably the same as the man currently sitting in their holding cell. "My God," Daniel whispered, scrolling through article after article. This wasn't just any foreign dignitary, this was the youngest head of state in Africa, a man who had led a popular revolution and was known internationally for his advocacy for African independence and social justice. Daniel's training kicked in. He printed several of the most official-looking photos and documents, then approached Thompson's desk with growing urgency. "Sergeant, we have a serious problem." Thompson looked up with mild irritation. "What kind of problem?" Daniel placed the printed materials on the desk. "The man in holding, he really is who he says he is, President Ibrahim Traore of Burkina Faso. These are official UN photos, international news coverage, diplomatic documentation." Thompson's face went pale as he examined the evidence. "Are you absolutely certain about this?" 100%. We've been holding a sitting head of state for 4 hours based on a complaint about him asking to use a phone. The implications hit both officers simultaneously. An international incident was unfolding in their small, suburban police station. Thompson immediately called the chief, who arrived within minutes looking like he had dressed hastily and driven at dangerous speeds. In the distance, he could hear the growing wail of sirens. The police cruiser rounded the corner, with its lights flashing but siren now silent, a professional courtesy to the upscale neighborhood where loud noises were generally discouraged, even during arrests. Ibrahim stood calmly on the sidewalk, his hands visible at his sides, drawing on every piece of training he had received about de-escalation and peaceful resolution of conflicts. 2 officers emerged from the vehicle. Officer Sarah Mitchell, a 10-year veteran with short blonde hair and the kind of confident stride that came from years of being in control, and Officer James Rodriguez, younger and newer to the force, with observant dark eyes that seemed to take in more details than his partner. "Sir, we received a report of a disturbance," Officer Mitchell announced, her hand resting casually but deliberately on her belt. "Can you tell us what you're doing in this neighborhood?" Ibrahim kept his voice level and respectful. "Officers, I'm visiting family. My cousin lives somewhere on Oak Street, and I'm afraid I've gotten lost. I asked this homeowner if I could use her phone to call my cousin, but she became alarmed. I understand her caution, and I've moved away from her property as requested." Officer Rodriguez stepped closer, studying Ibrahim's face. "Do you have identification?" "Yes, of course." Ibrahim began to reach slowly toward his jacket pocket. "Hold it right there," Officer Mitchell commanded sharply. "Keep your hands where we can see them. James, check his pockets." As Officer Rodriguez approached, Ibrahim said quietly, "Officers, if I may suggest, my identification is in my inside jacket pocket. I have a diplomatic passport and—" "Everyone's got a story," Officer Mitchell interrupted. "Save it for the station." Officer Rodriguez found the wallet and opened it. Ibrahim watched the young officer's face carefully, waiting for the moment of recognition that would clear up this misunderstanding. But Officer Rodriguez simply glanced at the documents without really examining them. His attention focused more on whether Ibrahim might be carrying weapons. "Clean," he reported to his partner. "Just a wallet, some cash, and what looks like foreign ID. "Foreign," Officer Mitchell repeated, as if that explained everything. "Turn around, sir. Hands behind your back." The handcuffs clicked into place with a sound that would haunt Ibrahim for weeks afterward. The metal was cold against his wrists, but the psychological weight was far heavier. As they guided him toward the patrol car, Ibrahim caught sight of the woman who had called police watching from her window, her face a mixture of satisfaction and continued wariness. "Officers," Ibrahim tried once more as they approached the vehicle, "if you would simply examine my identification carefully, I believe this misunderstanding can be resolved quickly." "That's what they all say," Officer Mitchell replied, opening the rear door. "Watch your head." The back seat of the police cruiser was a world unto itself, separated from the front by reinforced plexiglass, with door handles that didn't work from the inside and windows that couldn't be lowered. As they drove through the quiet streets toward the police station, Ibrahim found himself studying this neighborhood that had seemed so welcoming just an hour ago. From this new perspective, details he had missed before became obvious. The security cameras mounted discreetly under eaves, the "protected by" signs from various alarm companies, the way the sidewalks seemed to discourage pedestrian traffic. This was a community that had quite literally insulated itself from the outside world. In the front seat, the two officers were having a conversation they clearly thought Ibrahim couldn't hear. Another one, trying the visiting family story. They scout these neighborhoods, looking for empty houses, checking security setups. "Did you see his clothes, though?" Officer Rodriguez asked. "Pretty well dressed for a typical prowler." "That's exactly how they do it now. They dress the part, use sophisticated stories. The captain warned us about this new trend just last week." Ibrahim closed his eyes and leaned back against the hard plastic seat. He thought about Aisha, probably wondering where he was, maybe starting to worry when he didn't show up as planned. He thought about his own country, where he had spent the last 5 years working to build bridges between different ethnic groups, different economic classes, different religious communities. The irony was not lost on him that here, in the nation he had often looked to as a model of democracy and equality, he was experiencing firsthand the kind of prejudice he had only read about in reports. The police station was a modest brick building that looked like it had been built in the 1970s and updated sporadically ever since. Inside, the familiar institutional atmosphere of government buildings everywhere greeted them. Fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly ill, linoleum floors worn smooth by decades of foot traffic, and the peculiar smell of disinfectant mixed with old coffee. Ibrahim was processed with efficient indifference. His personal effects were catalogued: wallet, keys, a small notepad, and a pen with the presidential seal that no one bothered to examine closely. He was photographed, fingerprinted, and assigned a number. Through it all, he maintained the dignity that years of public service had ingrained in him, answering questions politely and following instructions without resistance. Chief Williams was a career law enforcement officer who had navigated his share of sensitive situations, but nothing had prepared him for this. After reviewing Daniel's research and examining Ibrahim's credentials himself, he stood in stunned silence for several moments. "How did this happen?" he finally asked. Thompson and the two arresting officers were called in for an immediate briefing. As the facts emerged, a picture of systemic failure became clear. Multiple opportunities to properly identify Ibrahim had been missed or dismissed. His attempts to explain his situation had been ignored. His dignity and rights had been violated, based on assumptions that had everything to do with racial bias, and nothing to do with actual evidence of wrongdoing. "We need to rectify this immediately," Chief Williams said, "and we need to do it right. Officer Chen, I want you to personally escort President Traore from holding and offer our sincere apologies. We'll arrange immediate transportation wherever he wishes to go." As they walked toward the holding cell, Chief Williams pulled Daniel aside. "This is going to become a very big story very quickly. How we handle the next hour will determine whether this department's reputation survives intact. Treat him with the respect we should have shown from the beginning." When the holding cell door opened, Ibrahim looked up to see a young Asian American officer with genuine remorse written across his features. Behind him stood an older man in a chief's uniform, whose discomfort was palpable. "Mr. President," Chief Williams began, "I cannot adequately express our regret for what has occurred here tonight. A serious error in judgment has been made, and we take full responsibility." Ibrahim stood slowly, his muscles stiff from hours on the uncomfortable bench. He studied both men's faces, reading the sincerity in their expressions. "Chief, what happened tonight is not unique to your department or your community. It happens every day to people who look like me who don't have the benefit of a diplomatic passport or international recognition." The handcuffs were removed with careful attention to Ibrahim's wrists, which bore red marks from the metal. Daniel offered to call for medical attention, but Ibrahim declined with a slight shake of his head. "Sir," Daniel said quietly, "I reviewed your identification personally. I apologize that it took so long for someone to treat you with the respect you deserve, not just as a president, but as a human being." Ibrahim nodded slowly. "Officer Chen, is it? Your willingness to look beyond assumptions may have prevented this situation from becoming even worse. Thank you for that." Chief Williams stepped forward. "Sir, we'd like to offer you transportation to your destination, and if you're willing, we'd appreciate the opportunity to discuss how we can ensure this never happens again." "I would appreciate the ride, and Chief, I think that conversation would be valuable not just for your department, but potentially for many others." The drive to Aisha's house was tense, despite the respectful treatment Ibrahim now received. Chief Williams had insisted on driving personally, while Daniel rode in the passenger seat. During the 20-minute drive, Ibrahim shared his perspective on what had occurred, speaking not with anger, but with the measured tone of someone who understood the broader implications. "I came here hoping to spend 2 days as a private citizen. I wanted to hold my cousin's babies, share family meals, and remember what it feels like to exist without the weight of national responsibility. Instead, I've been reminded that for people who look like me, anonymity can be dangerous." When they arrived at Aisha's house, the warm light spilling from the windows and the sound of babies crying inside created a sharp contrast to the cold institutional environment Ibrahim had left behind. Chief Williams walked with him to the front door, carrying the bag of personal effects that had been returned to Ibrahim. Aisha opened the door before they could ring the bell. She had been watching from the window as the police car pulled up, her heart racing with fear about what news it might bring. When she saw Ibrahim standing there, safe but clearly shaken, she burst into tears and threw her arms around him. "I thought something terrible had happened," she sobbed against his shoulder. "When you didn't come, when your phone went to voicemail, I imagined the worst." "I'm sorry I worried you," Ibrahim said softly, holding her tight. "There were some unexpected complications." Michael appeared in the doorway, holding one of the babies, his face a mixture of relief and confusion as he took in the scene, his cousin-in-law being embraced by his wife while a police chief stood awkwardly nearby. After introductions were made and the situation briefly explained, Chief Williams took his leave with promises that a full investigation would be conducted and reforms implemented. But before departing, he asked Ibrahim if he would be willing to meet with the department's training staff to discuss bias awareness and community policing. "I think that would be very valuable," Ibrahim agreed, "but I'd like to include some community members in those discussions as well. People who have experienced what I experienced tonight, but without the benefit of international attention." Finally alone with family, Ibrahim allowed himself to truly relax for the first time in months. Aisha's home was everything he had imagined: warm, filled with laughter, and the controlled chaos that comes with newborns. The triplets were tiny miracles, each with distinct personalities already emerging despite being just 6 weeks old. As Ibrahim held little Amara, the smallest of the three, he found himself thinking about the world she was inheriting. Would she grow up in a place where her mixed heritage, African through Aisha, Irish-American through Michael, would be celebrated or questioned? Would her brown skin be seen as beautiful or suspicious? "You're quiet," Aisha observed as she nursed one of the boys. "More quiet than usual, even for you." "I'm thinking about these little ones, about the world they're growing up in." "And about what happened tonight?" He nodded. "It made me realize how sheltered my position has made me. As president, I'm treated with automatic respect, even by people who disagree with my policies. Tonight, I experienced what millions of people face regularly: being judged as potentially dangerous simply because of how I look." Michael, who had been quietly listening while preparing bottles, spoke up. "I'm ashamed this happened in our community. Aisha told me about your work in Burkina Faso, about the changes you brought about. You deserve better than this." "It's not about what I deserve, it's about what everyone deserves. Basic human dignity, the presumption of innocence, the right to exist in public spaces without justifying your presence." Over the next day and a half, Ibrahim found the peace he had come seeking, but it was now colored by a deeper understanding of the challenges faced by people who didn't have the protection of political office. He played with the babies, shared meals with family, and even helped with middle-of-the-night feedings. But conversations inevitably returned to issues of justice, equality, and the work still to be done. Aisha, who worked as a social worker in Chicago, shared stories from her professional life that resonated deeply with Ibrahim's recent experience. Tales of families broken apart by assumptions and misunderstandings, of children who learned early to make themselves small and non-threatening, of parents who gave their children the talk about how to interact with police. "The hardest part," Aisha said during one late-night conversation as they fed the babies, "is explaining to families that this isn't their fault, while also teaching them how to survive in a system that often sees them as threats first and citizens second." Ibrahim nodded thoughtfully. "In Burkina Faso, we talk about decolonizing our minds, breaking free from the mental structures imposed by colonial rule. But tonight made me realize that this process is needed everywhere, not just in formerly colonized nations." By the next morning, word of the incident had begun to spread beyond the immediate participants. Despite Chief Williams' attempts to keep the matter quiet until a proper investigation could be conducted, one of the station's civilian employees had recognized Ibrahim's name and shared the story with a local reporter. Ibrahim's phone, now charged, began ringing constantly with calls from his staff, international media, and fellow African leaders expressing outrage and support. The story had legs, as journalists say, and it was running fast. "Mr. President," his chief of staff called from Ouagadougou, "the international media is picking up this story. CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera, they're all asking for statements. How do you want to handle this?" Ibrahim sat in Aisha's kitchen watching her feed the babies while Michael prepared breakfast. This domestic scene, so ordinary and yet so precious, reminded him of why he had made this trip in the first place. Schedule the press conference, he decided, but not in Washington or New York. Here, in front of the police station where this happened, and invite local community leaders, especially those who have experienced similar treatment. His staff was concerned about the optics of a sitting president holding a press conference about his own arrest. But Ibrahim was firm. This was bigger than personal embarrassment or diplomatic protocol. This was about truth-telling and the kind of leadership that required standing in difficult spaces. Young Officer Daniel Chen, meanwhile, was experiencing his own crisis of conscience. He had gone home after his shift unable to sleep, replaying the events of the evening and thinking about all the assumptions he had made about people throughout his brief career. His training had emphasized officer safety and threat assessment, but had it adequately prepared him to see the humanity in every person he encountered? The next morning, Daniel requested a meeting with Chief Williams. "Sir, I need to tell you something about last night that's been bothering me." Chief Williams, who was dealing with a growing media storm and pressure from city officials, barely looked up from his desk. "Make it quick, Chen." "When I first saw President Traore in holding, something felt wrong. Not wrong like he was dangerous, but wrong like we had made a mistake. My instincts told me to investigate further, but I second-guessed myself because the senior officers seemed so certain about what kind of person he was." Chief Williams finally gave Daniel his full attention. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if I had trusted my instincts and done the job I was trained to do, properly examine identification, listen to the person's story, treat everyone with basic respect, this never would have escalated. We failed at the most basic level of police work." The chief was quiet for a long moment. "Chen, you're the one who ultimately identified him correctly. You're the one who made sure he was treated properly once we realized our mistake. But I could have prevented the mistake entirely if I had been braver, if I had been willing to question the assumptions being made by officers with more seniority than me." This conversation would later prove crucial, as it highlighted the complex dynamics within police departments that could either perpetuate or prevent incidents like Ibrahim's arrest. The scene outside the Winnetka Police Department the following afternoon was unprecedented for the quiet suburb. News vans lined the street, reporters from national and international outlets prepared their equipment, and community members gathered to witness what many recognized as a historic moment. Ibrahim arrived not in an official vehicle, but in Michael's modest family sedan, with Aisha beside him and the babies safely at home with Michael's mother. He had insisted on this arrangement. He wanted to approach this moment as the person he had been when arrested, not as the president he was returning to being. The press conference began with Chief Williams offering a formal apology, but Ibrahim had requested to speak immediately afterward, while the media's attention was focused and before the narrative could be shaped by others. "Yesterday I came to this community not as President Traore, but as Ibrahim, a cousin, excited to meet 3 new family members. I had no security detail, no official protocols, no advance team preparing the way. I was simply a man who got lost and asked for help." He paused, allowing the simple humanity of that image to settle over his audience. What happened next was not unique. What happened next happens every day in communities across this nation and around the world. A person of color existing in a space where others have decided he doesn't belong. A request for basic human assistance met with suspicion and fear. A presumption of guilt based not on actions but on appearance. In the crowd, Ibrahim could see faces reflecting a range of emotions: shame, recognition, defensiveness, and thoughtful consideration. Some community members had come to show support, others to defend their neighborhood, and still others simply to witness what was clearly a significant moment. "I want to be clear about something," Ibrahim continued. "This is not about punishment or revenge. This is about recognition and change. The officers who arrested me were doing what they had been trained to do, responding to fears that had been cultivated in this community over time. But training can be changed, fears can be examined, and assumptions can be challenged." A reporter from CNN called out a question. "Mr. President, do you plan to file formal complaints or pursue legal action?" Ibrahim shook his head. "Individual punishment will not solve a systemic problem. What I hope comes from this experience is a deeper conversation about how we see each other, how we treat strangers, and how we can build communities based on understanding rather than fear. Another reporter pressed, but surely there must be consequences for the officers involved. The consequence I want is education, training that helps officers see the person before the profile, policies that require actual investigation before assumption, and community dialogue that acknowledges the reality of racial bias while working actively to address it. From the back of the crowd, an elderly African-American man raised his hand. Ibrahim nodded towards him. "Mr. President, my name is James Washington. I've lived in the Chicago area for 73 years, and what happened to you has happened to my sons, my grandsons, and countless others in our community. The difference is, when it happens to us, there's no press conference. What do you say to families like ours?" The question hung in the air as a challenge and an invitation. Ibrahim took a moment before responding, understanding that his answer would be scrutinized not just by the media, but by communities who had long felt voiceless in these conversations. "Mr. Washington, you're absolutely right. My experience last night was notable only because of the office I hold. But the humiliation, the fear, the dehumanization, that's the daily reality for too many people. I can use my platform to amplify these stories, but the real change has to come from all of us individually and collectively, deciding that this treatment of our fellow human beings is unacceptable." He gestured toward the police station behind him. "This building represents authority, order, protection. It should be a place where every citizen feels safe seeking help. When it becomes a place where seeking help leads to suspicion and arrest, we have lost something fundamental about what it means to serve and protect." The press conference ended, but its impact was just beginning. Within hours, #RememberWhoIam was trending globally on social media, a hashtag inspired by Ibrahim's closing words about seeing the person behind the appearance. The story dominated news cycles across multiple continents, sparking conversations about racial profiling, diplomatic protocol, and the treatment of African leaders on the international stage. In Burkina Faso, citizens gathered around radios and television screens to hear his president's words. Many felt a mix of pride in his dignified response and anger at his treatment. Protest demonstrations were planned, but Ibrahim personally called for calm, emphasizing that the goal should be positive change rather than retribution. Back in Winnetka, the community was grappling with an uncomfortable mirror being held up to their assumptions and biases. Town hall meetings were hastily organized. Neighbors who had never discussed race were suddenly forced to confront their own prejudices. Some doubled down on their defensive positions, but many others began to question what they had accepted as normal. Mrs. Henderson, the woman who had called the police, became a reluctant symbol of the incident. Media crews camped outside her rose garden, seeking interviews she steadfastly refused to give. Her neighbors were divided, some supporting her actions as reasonable caution, others ashamed that their community had been represented in such a negative light. But it was Daniel Chen who perhaps experienced the most profound transformation. The young officer requested additional training on cultural sensitivity and bias recognition. He began studying the psychological research on implicit bias, learning about the unconscious associations that could influence split-second decisions in high-pressure situations. More importantly, Daniel became an advocate within his own department for policy changes. He proposed that all foreign identification documents be automatically verified through proper diplomatic channels rather than dismissed. He suggested that community policing efforts include more diverse voices and perspectives, and he volunteered to be part of a new training program that would help officers recognize and interrupt their own biased assumptions. While the world debated the larger implications of Ibrahim's arrest, Aisha was dealing with her own complex emotions. She had grown up straddling two worlds, her father's Burkinabe heritage and her mother's American upbringing, and had always believed that her middle-class suburban life insulated her from the kind of discrimination that made headlines. "I was naive," she confided to Ibrahim during a quiet moment as they sat together watching the babies sleep. "I thought that by living here, by marrying Michael, by having these beautiful mixed-race children, I was somehow proof that we had moved beyond all of this." Ibrahim listened as she continued. "But seeing what happened to you, knowing that it could happen to Michael when he's carrying one of our sons, or to our children when they're older, it's terrifying. I've been living in a bubble." "It's not naivety," he replied gently, "it's hope. And hope is necessary, but hope paired with awareness is even more powerful." They talked late into the night about the complexities of raising mixed-race children in America, about the conversations Aisha and Michael would need to have as their children grew older, about the balance between protecting innocence and preparing them for reality. "I want them to be proud of all their heritage, but I also want them to be safe," Aisha said. "Those shouldn't be contradictory goals," Ibrahim observed. "The fact that they sometimes are is exactly what needs to change." Daniel Chen couldn't stop thinking about the missed opportunities from that night. During his days off, he found himself reading everything he could find about racial bias in policing, about the experiences of immigrants and people of color in suburban communities, about the psychological factors that led good people to make harmful assumptions. He reached out to local community organizations, asking to volunteer his time to better understand the perspectives of people who might view police with suspicion or fear. These conversations were often uncomfortable, forcing him to confront the reality that his uniform, which he had always seen as a symbol of protection and service, was experienced by many as a symbol of potential threat. One particularly impactful conversation was with Mrs. Gloria Watkins, a 68-year-old African-American woman who had moved to Winnetka in the 1980s as one of the first black families in the neighborhood. "Officer Chen," she said during a community dialogue session that Daniel had helped organize, "I appreciate your willingness to listen, but you need to understand that what happened to the president wasn't shocking to people like me. It was Tuesday." She went on to describe decades of subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination, being followed in stores, having neighbors call police about her teenage sons playing basketball in their own driveway, being asked repeatedly if she was visiting when she walked in her own neighborhood. "The difference," Mrs. Watkins explained, "is that when it happened to President Traore, people cared. When it happens to regular folks like us, it's just another day." Daniel asked what would have to change for her to feel truly safe and welcomed in her own community. "Start with seeing us as neighbors instead of threats," she replied. "Ask questions instead of making assumptions, and when you make mistakes, because everyone makes mistakes, own them and do better." These conversations fundamentally changed how Daniel approached his job. He began documenting patterns in police calls, noting when reports of suspicious activity seemed to correlate more with the race of the person reported than with any actual threatening behavior. He advocated for policy changes that would require more thorough investigation before arrests could be made based solely on neighbor complaints. Chief Williams had promised a thorough investigation, and he delivered. The Internal Affairs Review revealed a troubling pattern of assumptions and shortcuts that had led to Ibrahim's arrest. Officer Mitchell and Officer Rodriguez were found to have violated several departmental policies regarding proper identification procedures and respectful treatment of all individuals. But the investigation went deeper than individual officer conduct. It examined the training materials used by the department, the unofficial cultural norms that shaped officer behavior, and the feedback loop between community fears and police responses. The report, when released publicly, was damning in its honesty. It acknowledged that implicit bias had played a role in the incident, and that the department's training had been inadequate in preparing officers to recognize and counteract their own prejudices. Officer Mitchell, faced with the evidence of her misconduct, initially responded defensively. "I was protecting the community," she insisted during her disciplinary hearing. "We get calls all the time about suspicious people casing houses. How was I supposed to know he was really a president?" "By doing your job properly," Chief Williams replied. "By examining his identification. By listening to his explanation. By treating him with the basic respect that every person deserves until proven otherwise." The disciplinary actions were significant but not career-ending. Both officers were required to undergo extensive bias training, community service in predominantly minority neighborhoods, and a probationary period during which their interactions with the public would be closely monitored. But perhaps more importantly, the incident became a catalyst for department-wide changes. New protocols were established for handling identification documents from foreign nations. Training curricula were revised to include substantial components on implicit bias, cultural sensitivity, and de-escalation techniques. And a community oversight board was created to provide ongoing feedback on police-community relations. The international reaction to Ibrahim's arrest was swift and multifaceted. African Union leaders expressed outrage at the treatment of one of their members, with some calling for formal diplomatic protests. Social media campaigns emerged, demanding apologies and policy changes. Academic conferences were hastily organized to discuss the incident as a case study in racial profiling and diplomatic immunity. But Ibrahim himself was careful to frame the conversation in broader terms. In interviews with international media, he consistently redirected attention from his personal experience to the systemic issues it represented. "I was inconvenienced for a few hours," he told a BBC reporter. "But children in communities around the world grow up believing that their skin color makes them inherently suspicious. That is the real tragedy here." His measured response frustrated some who wanted him to be more confrontational, but it also elevated the discussion beyond partisan politics or international finger-pointing. Instead of becoming a diplomatic incident between nations, the story became a catalyst for examining racial bias as a global phenomenon. Universities began inviting Ibrahim to speak about the intersection of leadership and social justice. His perspective as both a head of state and a victim of racial profiling provided a unique lens through which to examine these issues. During one such speaking engagement at Northwestern University, just 30 miles from where he had been arrested, Ibrahim addressed an auditorium full of students, professors, and community members. Leadership is often thought of as the ability to command others, but the most important kind of leadership is the ability to command yourself, to respond to injustice with wisdom rather than anger, to use personal pain as a bridge to universal understanding. A student asked how he had maintained his composure during the arrest and its aftermath. "I drew strength from knowing that my response would be watched and judged," Ibrahim replied. "If I had responded with anger or demands for special treatment, it would have reinforced stereotypes about African leaders being unstable or unreasonable. By responding with dignity, I hope to demonstrate that the problem was not with my character, but with the assumptions made about it." The Winnetka incident, as it came to be known in police training circles, prompted policy reviews in departments across the country. The combination of international attention and local community pressure created a unique opportunity for meaningful reform. The Winnetka Police Department became an unexpected leader in progressive police reform. Chief Williams, initially defensive about his department's reputation, gradually embraced the opportunity to create a model program that other communities could emulate. The changes were comprehensive. Training reform. All officers were required to complete 40 hours of additional training on implicit bias, cultural competency, and de-escalation techniques. This training was developed in partnership with local universities, community organizations, and international human rights groups. Policy changes. New protocols required that all foreign identification documents be properly verified before any arrest could be made. Officers were required to document their reasoning for any detention, with special scrutiny for cases involving people of color. Community engagement. Monthly forums were established where community members could interact with officers in non-enforcement settings. These sessions included cultural exchange programs, youth mentorship opportunities, and collaborative problem-solving initiatives. Accountability measures. Body cameras became mandatory for all patrol officers, with footage reviewed regularly for bias indicators. A civilian oversight board was established with meaningful authority to investigate complaints and recommend disciplinary action. Officer Rodriguez, initially resistant to these changes, gradually came to understand their value. During a community forum 6 months after the incident, he publicly acknowledged his role in what had happened to Ibrahim. "I made assumptions that night based on fear rather than facts," he told the assembled crowd. "President Traore's dignity in the face of our mistakes taught me more about policing than 10 years of experience had. I'm committed to doing better." Officer Mitchell's journey was more difficult. She eventually requested a transfer to a different department, feeling that she could not effectively serve a community that had lost trust in her judgment. Her departure was seen by some as accountability and by others as a loss of an experienced officer. But for Daniel Chen and others committed to reform, it represented the reality that some attitudes could not be easily changed. 6 months after the incident, Ibrahim returned to the Chicago area for a follow-up visit. This time, the trip was official. He was invited to speak at a conference on international relations hosted by the University of Chicago. But he made sure to schedule time for a personal visit with Aisha and the babies. The changes in the community were noticeable. The Winnetka Police Department had become a model for other suburban departments grappling with similar issues. Crime rates had actually decreased as community trust in police increased, leading to better cooperation and communication between residents and law enforcement. Daniel Chen had been promoted to detective and was leading the department's new community liaison program. He had also become something of a spokesperson for police reform, speaking at law enforcement conferences about the importance of questioning assumptions and treating every interaction as an opportunity to build rather than break trust. "The night I met President Traore changed my understanding of what it means to protect and serve. I learned that sometimes the biggest threat to public safety is our own biases and assumptions," Daniel told a gathering of police academy graduates. The broader impact extended far beyond one suburban police department. The incident had sparked conversations in communities across America about the reality of racial profiling and the need for systemic change. Some of these conversations were difficult and uncomfortable, but they were happening. In schools, in workplaces, in neighborhoods that had previously avoided discussing race altogether. During his return visit, Ibrahim made a point of walking through the same neighborhood where he had been arrested. This time, he was recognized by several residents, who approached him with a mixture of curiosity and embarrassment. Mrs. Henderson, the woman who had called the police, was working in her rose garden when Ibrahim passed by. She looked up, saw him, and, after a moment of internal struggle, approached the sidewalk. "Mr. President," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I owe you an apology." Ibrahim stopped and turned to face her fully. "Mrs. Henderson, isn't it?" She nodded, surprised that he remembered her name from the police reports. "I've been thinking about that night for months, about what I said, how I acted. I was wrong." "What changed your mind?" Ibrahim asked gently. "My grandson," she replied, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "He's adopted, from Guatemala. He's only 8 years old, but last month someone called the police on him for playing in the park by himself, said a foreign-looking child was unsupervised and might be lost or abandoned. When I got that call, when I had to explain to an 8-year-old why a stranger thought he didn't belong in his own neighborhood, I understood what I had done to you." Ibrahim reached out and gently touched her arm. "Mrs. Henderson, it takes courage to examine our own actions and admit when we've been wrong. That's how real change begins." They talked for several more minutes, with Mrs. Henderson sharing her new perspective on community safety and belonging. Before parting, she asked if Ibrahim would like to see her roses, the same garden that had drawn him to her door that evening months ago. "They're at their best right now, and I've been thinking, maybe beauty is what draws us together, not what keeps us apart." As Ibrahim admired the carefully tended blooms, he reflected on the unexpected ways that understanding could grow from conflict, how pain could become the soil for wisdom. Aisha's triplets were now sitting up, babbling, and beginning to show distinct personalities. Amara was the quiet observer, watching everything with serious dark eyes. Malik was the charmer, smiling at anyone who would pay attention to him. And Zara was the adventurer, constantly trying to escape whatever container her parents placed her in. As Ibrahim played with them in Aisha's living room, he marveled at their innocence and potential. They had no awareness of the complicated world they were inheriting, no understanding of the challenges they might face because of their mixed heritage. To them, love was love, attention was attention, and safety was simply the presence of caring adults. "I think about their future a lot," Aisha said, watching Ibrahim make silly faces that sent Malik into delighted giggles. "Will they grow up in a world where their grandfather's arrest is an old story that helped change things? Or will they face the same assumptions and barriers?" "That depends on all of us," Ibrahim replied, "on whether we use experiences like mine to build bridges or walls." Michael, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "I've been thinking about that night a lot too, about my own assumptions, my own comfort with staying silent when things don't directly affect me. I realize now that I've been part of the problem just by not being part of the solution." This conversation led to Michael becoming involved in local civil rights organizations, using his position as a white professional in the community to advocate for policy changes and challenge bias when he encountered it. His transformation illustrated how allies could emerge from unexpected places when presented with clear examples of injustice. A year after the incident, Ibrahim was invited back to Northwestern University to deliver the commencement address. His speech, titled "The Dignity of Every Door," drew on his experience in Winnetka to explore broader themes of human connection, social justice, and the responsibility of leadership. "Every door we knock on is an opportunity," he told the graduating class. "An opportunity to see and be seen, to offer and receive help, to build understanding across the lines that divide us. The question is not whether we will face closed doors in our lives. We will. The question is how we will respond when doors are closed to us, and how we will choose to open doors for others. The speech was widely praised and became required reading in several university programs studying international relations and social justice. But for Ibrahim, the most meaningful moment came after the ceremony when Daniel Chen approached him with a special guest. "Mr. President, I'd like you to meet my daughter, Lisa. She's starting college in the fall, and she wrote her admissions essay about the night we met." Lisa Chen was 18 years old, with her father's thoughtful eyes and her mother's warm smile. She had grown up hearing about her father's work as a police officer, but the Winnetka incident had opened new conversations in their household about justice, bias, and the responsibility of those in positions of authority. "My dad talks about that night a lot," Lisa told Ibrahim, "about how you taught him that real strength comes from admitting mistakes and working to do better. That's the kind of leader I want to be someday." Ibrahim was deeply moved by this encounter. "Your father showed great courage that night, and even greater courage in the months that followed. Change often begins with one person willing to stand up and say, 'This isn't right.'" As Ibrahim prepared to return to Burkina Faso after this anniversary visit, he reflected on how dramatically one evening had altered not just his own perspective, but the lives of countless others. The incident had become a case study in police training programs worldwide. Academic papers had been written analyzing the diplomatic, social, and psychological aspects of what had occurred. Policy changes had been implemented in dozens of communities. But beyond the formal impacts, Ibrahim was most proud of the personal transformations he had witnessed. Daniel Chen had become a leader in police reform. Mrs. Henderson had become an advocate for immigrant families in her community. Aisha and Michael had become more active in civil rights organizations. Even officers Rodriguez and Mitchell, in their different ways, had been forced to confront and change their approaches to their work. The night before his departure, the Winnetka Police Department hosted a community dinner, an unprecedented event that brought together residents, officers, and local civil rights leaders for conversation and relationship building. Ibrahim was the guest of honor, but he insisted that the evening focus on ongoing work rather than past incidents. During his remarks, he shared a perspective that had crystallized over the year of reflection and dialogue that had followed his arrest. "I came to your community hoping to be invisible, to blend in, to experience the simple pleasure of anonymity. Instead, I became hyper-visible, a symbol of something much larger than myself. But I've learned that visibility can be a form of responsibility. When we are seen, really seen, we have the opportunity to change how others see the world." He paused, looking around the room at faces that had become familiar over the past year. Daniel and his family, Mrs. Henderson with her grandson, Mrs. Watkins and other longtime community members, Chief Williams and his staff, and dozens of neighbors who had been forced to examine their own assumptions about safety, belonging, and community. The question is not whether bias exists. It does, in all of us, shaped by our experiences and fears and the stories we tell ourselves about safety and difference. The question is what we do when that bias is revealed. Do we defend it, or do we challenge ourselves to grow beyond it? 2 years after the arrest, Ibrahim made his final visit to the Chicago area in his capacity as president. Political changes in Burkina Faso meant that he would be stepping down from office, returning to private life and the possibility of the anonymity he had originally sought.
The occasion was bittersweet. He was leaving office with significant accomplishments in improving education, healthcare, and economic opportunities for his people, but also with the knowledge that much work remained to be done. Aisha's children were now toddlers, walking and talking and filling their house with the joyful chaos of early childhood. As Ibrahim watched them play together, oblivious to the racial categories that had caused so much trouble for the adults in their lives, he felt a deep sense of hope. "They don't see color yet," Aisha observed, following his gaze. "They just see playmates, siblings, people who love them." "The challenge," Ibrahim replied, "is helping them maintain that clarity as they grow older and the world tries to teach them to see divisions instead of connections." During this visit, Ibrahim also spent time with Daniel Chen, who had recently been promoted to lieutenant and was overseeing the department's community policing initiatives. The young officer had become a frequent speaker at police academies and law enforcement conferences, sharing the lessons learned from his encounter with Ibrahim. "I've been thinking about writing a book," Daniel confided during a coffee meeting, "about that night, about what I learned, about how police officers can better serve diverse communities." Ibrahim encouraged the project. "Your perspective as someone who is willing to admit mistakes and change is valuable. Too often, these conversations happen without the voices of officers who have actually gone through the process of examining their own biases." On his final flight back to Burkina Faso as president, Ibrahim found himself reflecting on the unexpected journey that had begun with a simple desire to surprise his cousin and hold her new babies. What should have been a private family visit had become a public lesson in dignity, bias, and the possibility of change. The incident had followed him throughout the remainder of his presidency, shaping his approach to domestic policies about policing and social justice. It had also influenced his international advocacy, as he spoke more frequently about the global nature of racial bias and the need for systemic solutions. As the plane descended toward Ouagadougou, Ibrahim could see the familiar landscape of his homeland spreading out below. Soon he would once again be a private citizen, able to move through the world without the constant awareness of being watched and judged that came with high office. But he knew that the lessons learned in that Winnetka holding cell would stay with him forever. The experience of being reduced to stereotypes and assumptions, of having his humanity questioned based on his appearance, had given him a deeper understanding of the challenges faced by marginalized people everywhere. 5 years after the arrest that changed so many lives, the participants in the story had moved on to new chapters, but the lessons remained relevant. Daniel Chen had indeed written his book, Seeing Beyond the Badge, A Police Officer's Journey Through Bias and Reform. It became required reading in police academies across the country and was translated into multiple languages. Daniel himself had left the Winnetka Police Department to work with a national organization dedicated to police reform and community healing. Mrs. Henderson had become an unlikely advocate for immigrant rights, working with local organizations to help new residents navigate the complex social dynamics of suburban American communities. Her rose garden had become a gathering place for neighborhood conversations about diversity and inclusion. Officer Rodriguez had completed his bias training and remained with the Winnetka Police Department, where he became known for his patient and respectful interactions with all community members. Officer Mitchell had eventually left law enforcement entirely, finding work in private security where her suspicious nature was considered an asset rather than a liability. The Winnetka Police Department itself had become a model for progressive policing, hosting delegations from other departments seeking to implement similar reforms. Crime rates in the community had decreased as trust between police and residents increased, proving that effective law enforcement and social justice were not opposing goals. Aisha's children were now old enough to understand simple stories about fairness and kindness.
She had begun telling them an age-appropriate version of their Uncle Ibrahim's visit, focusing on the importance of helping others and treating everyone with respect. And Ibrahim himself, now a private citizen once again, had founded an international organization focused on human rights education and police reform. He traveled the world sharing his story and facilitating conversations about bias, dignity, and the possibility of change. The organization's motto, displayed prominently in its offices in Ouagadougou, Chicago, and Brussels, was simple: see the person first. In quiet moments, Ibrahim sometimes thought back to that evening when he had stood on an unfamiliar sidewalk, listening to sirens approaching, realizing that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. At the time, it had felt like a personal failure, his plan for anonymity disrupted, his simple family visit complicated by forces beyond his control. But with the perspective of time, he understood that sometimes the most important journeys are the ones we never planned to take. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from our most difficult experiences, and sometimes the greatest service we can provide is to allow our personal pain to become a bridge toward universal understanding.
The story of President Ibrahim Traore's arrest in Winnetka had become more than just a news cycle or a case study. It had become a reminder that dignity is not determined by title or office, that justice is not automatic but must be actively pursued, and that change is possible when people are willing to look honestly at themselves and commit to doing better. In the end, Ibrahim's wish had been granted, though not in the way he had expected. He had indeed spent time as just another human being, experiencing the world as millions of others experienced it daily. And in that shared humanity, he had found both the source of the problem and the seed of its solution. The door he had knocked on that evening had been closed to him, but in the months and years that followed, countless other doors had opened. Doors to understanding, to reform, to the possibility that communities could choose to be defined by their welcome rather than their walls. And in a house on Oak Street in Winnetka, 3 children continued to grow, playing together without awareness of the categories that had once seemed so important to the adults around them, living proof that the world their parents were working to create was not just possible, but already beginning to emerge.